He grabbed Jamal by the arm without warning, twisting it behind his back as Jamal cried out in pain. "Stop resisting!" Jamal shouted, breath hitching in panic. "I didn't do anything." But the officer, whose name tag read Crawford, only gripped him harder, ignoring the agony he was causing. "Don't talk back!" Officer Crawford barked, forcing Jamal forward until his cheek pressed against the hood of the patrol car. "You think you can mouth off to me? You think you can just walk around here acting like you own the place?" And Jamal, wincing, tried to find a shred of composure, tried to piece together the chaos that had erupted within mere seconds, because only a few minutes ago, he was chatting with the grocery store owner, Mr. Huang, about the rising cost of produce, about how the summer was scorching the local gardens. And now this blue lights flashing, adrenaline spiking, the humiliating sense that he was being treated like a criminal in broad daylight. Meanwhile, onlookers stood frozen, uncertain whether to intervene or keep their distance. A few whispered, "That's Jamal. He's a local teacher. What's happening? And he's never been in trouble. What is this?" But fear of stepping in against a uniformed officer kept them pinned to the edges of the sidewalk. Then, Mr. Huang himself burst out of the store, voice tight with alarm. "Officer, please, what's going on?" he asked, though the officer's only response was to shove Jamal's shoulder, pinning him harder. "I said, don't resist," Crawford snapped, ignoring Mr. Huang's plea. "Stay back, citizen. This man is under suspicion." And Mr. Huang glanced at Jamal, eyes widening. "Suspicion of what?" "He shops here all the time. He just left with groceries." And Crawford lifted his chin. "I got a report of a suspicious individual matching his description." He lied, because as later revealed by the shaky phone footage, he'd merely spotted Jamal and decided something looked off. "Now step away before I take you in too." And Mr. Huang swallowed hard, stepping back with raised hands. "I'm just trying to tell you, he didn't do anything," he insisted. But the officer's gaze flicked over him disdainfully, as if ignoring the obvious truth. A woman nearby, a regular customer of the store named Beverly, aimed her phone camera steadily. "Officer, the first recording this," she said, voice trembling. "I don't see him resisting. Why are you hurting him?" And Crawford shot her a withering glare. "Stop recording or I'll confiscate that phone," he threatened. But Beverly held her ground, even though her hands shook. "I have every right to record," she insisted. "He hasn't done anything." But Crawford only pressed his weight against Jamal again, the crack of bone and cartilage audible enough to make people flinch. "You sure about that, lady?" he snarled. "You want to join him?" And Jamal's vision blurred, from pain and anger and sheer disbelief that this was happening to him. A man who dedicated his life to teaching kids literature and history, a man whose greatest aspiration was to see his students succeed, now pinned like a dangerous criminal for reasons unknown. Moments later, another cruiser pulled up, lights flashing, and a second officer, a young rookie named Daniels, rushed over. "Crawford, what's going on?" he asked, eyes darting between Jamal and the gathering crowd. "I got a call. Thought I'd back you up." And Crawford jerked his head at Jamal. "Suspicious individual. Resisting arrest." He spat. "Help me get him into the car." But Daniels hesitated, seeing Jamal's face contorted in pain, hearing the hushed confusion of bystanders. "Did you confirm his identity or get a statement?" Daniels asked carefully, but Crawford's look was thunderous. "Don't question me, rookie. Just help." And so Daniels stepped forward uncertainly. "Sir, are you hurt? You can't just do that to an innocent man." People were pulling out phones, filming from every angle. Crawford, sensing the tide turning, clenched his jaw. "All of you better step back. I'm the law here," he declared. But his bravado wasn't stopping anyone from recording or voicing their shock. Suddenly, a woman in a neat skirt and blazer pushed through the crowd, hair pinned back in a tight bun. Her name was Charisse, a local attorney who recognized Jamal from a community meeting about school funding the previous month. "Officer, let him go," Charisse demanded, voice vibrating with anger. You have no probable cause and you're using excessive force. And Crawford let out a barking laugh. Probable cause. He's suspicious. That's enough. And Charisse shook her head. That's not how the law works. And you know it, she snapped. Either release him or give us the specific charge. And Crawford shrugged. I don't have to answer to you, he said, eyes glittering with a kind of smug superiority that made Jamal's stomach turn. At that moment, the shift manager from the grocery store, a tall black man named Wesley, came out, carrying a small paper bag. Hey, mister. In the distance, more sirens echoed, perhaps other officers responding to the call or to the commotion, and within minutes, a police SUV arrived, out of which stepped Sergeant Ellis, a middle-aged black man with a stoic, no-nonsense demeanor. What's going on here? He demanded, scanning the tense scene, the drawn faces in the crowd, the pained expression on Jamal. Crawford, report! And Crawford immediately straightened. We have a suspicious suspect, resisting arrest, he said, gesturing harshly to Jamal, probably on something. But Charisse's voice cut through the air. He was just grocery shopping. We have proof. We have witnesses and recordings, she said. That man is a teacher in this community, not some criminal. And Ellis's gaze narrowed, shifting to Jamal, who was clearly in pain. Is that true? Ellis asked in a calm but firm tone. You're a local teacher. And Jamal managed a nod despite his predicament. Yes, sir. Ow. He attacked me out of nowhere, he said, wincing at the pain in his cuffed wrists. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Sergeant Ellis turned on Crawford. Did you confirm the suspicion? Did you run his ID? Talk to the store owner? Anything? And Crawford jutted his chin defiantly. He fit the description. I had reason to believe, but Ellis's voice went dangerously low. Reason to believe what? He asked, scanning the scene for any sign that Jamal was the threat Crawford claimed. Daniel stepped forward. Sergeant, I just arrived, but it looks like Mr. Jamal gasped in relief, cradling his sore arms against his chest, while Beverly, Charisse, and others rushed over to check on him. Are you okay? Beverly asked, turning her phone to capture the moment. Look at these marks, my God. And indeed, Jamal's wrists were reddened and bruised. I'll be fine, Jamal said, voice still shaky. Thank you for recording. And Beverly gave him a reassuring nod. Meanwhile, Sergeant Ellis took Crawford aside, speaking in a low, terse whisper that the crowd couldn't fully hear, but they could catch snippets of anger. Is this how you handle unacceptable, could have caused a lawsuit, abuse of power? And Crawford's face was turning a mottled shade of red as he glared at the ground. At that moment, Mr. Huang hurried over with a bottle of water, pressing it into Jamal's hand. Here, for you, he said, voice filled with concern. Please, sit down inside. We'll call an ambulance if you need one. And Jamal gave a small, grateful smile. I'm okay, just sore, he murmured, and then he followed Mr. Huang into the store's small seating area near the checkout, where he sank onto a chair, massaging his wrists and trying to steady his racing heart. Outside, the crowd was dispersing slightly as Ellis instructed Daniels to take statements. Talk to the witnesses, gather their information, he said. Then I want you to file a preliminary report. Crawford. Ellis's voice was tight as he addressed the older officer. You stay here. Keep your mouth shut unless spoken to. And Crawford's glare was venomous, but he held his tongue. Over the next hour, the tension simmered as Daniels diligently took statements from Beverly, Charisse, Mr. Huang, Wesley, and several other bystanders. Sergeant Ellis stepped into the store to check on Jamal. You need medical attention? Ellis sighed. That's your right, he said. I just want you to know not all of us behave like Crawford. And Jamal forced a small nod of acknowledgement. I appreciate it, he said, but it shouldn't be happening at all. The scene had the whole community in a quiet uproar. News traveled fast, and within a day, local blogs and social media posts were flooded with the story. Officer uses excessive force on innocent teacher, Racial profiling on Elm Street, accompanied by Beverly's live-streamed video and photos of Jamal's bruised wrists. People were outraged, demanding accountability, while others made excuses or tried to defend Crawford, claiming we needed law and order. But the outcry was significant enough that the department had to place Crawford on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. Jamal, meanwhile, tried to return to his normal routine teaching at the local high school, preparing lesson plans, encouraging students to explore literature and express themselves, but he found himself continually distracted, replaying the scene in his mind, hearing Crawford's harsh words, feeling the pressure on his arms. "You think you can mouth off to me?" It was as though a shadow had fallen across every normal activity in his life. One afternoon, a few days after the incident, Jamal's principal, Miss Donovan, called him into her office. "Jamal, close the door," she said kindly, beckoning him to sit in a chair opposite her desk. "I've been hearing from staff, parents, even students about what happened," and Jamal's shoulders tensed. "I'm sorry if it's causing a stir," he said softly. "I didn't ask for it, But Miss Donovan held up a hand. "You don't need to apologize," she said. "Everyone is concerned about you. I'm concerned about you. We support you here, Jamal. We want you to know that." And a lump rose in Jamal's throat as he nodded. "Thank you," he whispered, remembering how powerless he felt pinned against the car. "Miss." Donovan leaned forward. "There's talk about a protest, or a community rally, calling for accountability," she said. "Some parents want to organize it outside the precinct, and your name came up. They'd like you to attend, or even speak," and Jamal's eyes widened. "Speak?" he repeated, mind flashing with images of a large crowd, cameras, media coverage. "I'm not sure," he muttered. "I just want to teach and move on." "But," Miss Donovan gave him a sympathetic look, "you have every right to feel that way, but you also have a voice, Jamal," she said. "You're a respected figure in this community, and people want to see justice served. If you don't feel comfortable, you don't have to do anything. But if you do, you have the school's backing." And Jamal considered it, heart pounding with the weight of that choice. Ultimately, he decided to at least attend the rally, if only to show solidarity with those who were outraged by the injustice. So on a hot Saturday afternoon, he found himself standing on the steps of City Hall, next to Cherise and other community leaders, facing a crowd of protesters holding signs reading "Justice for Jamal," "Stop racial profiling," and "Hold dirty cops accountable," the midday sun beating down on them. People cheered and clapped as Cherise stepped up to a small microphone. "We are here today to demand an end to police brutality and racial profiling," she began, voice echoing across the plaza. "We're here to support our friend and neighbor, Jamal Harris, who was targeted, harassed, and assaulted for no reason other than the color of his skin," and the crowd erupted in supportive yells, fists raised. Jamal stood there, nerves in knots, as Cherise turned to him. "Jamal, do you want to say a few words?" she asked, extending the microphone, and for a moment he hesitated, sweat trickling down his temple. Among the crowd was a local news crew capturing every word, and by evening, Jamal's speech was circulating on social media, drawing even more attention to the case. Meanwhile, the police department scrambled to manage the PR crisis. Internal Affairs was forced to expedite their investigation into Crawford's conduct. Within 2 weeks, there was enough evidence footage, witness testimonies, and a string of prior complaints about Crawford for the department to announce that he'd be suspended indefinitely without pay, pending possible termination. The news sent waves of relief through the community, though some worried it was just to placate public pressure. On the day Jamal heard the announcement, he was at school, finishing grading papers, and Miss Donovan tapped on his classroom door. "They're letting Crawford go," she said, stepping inside. "Suspending him, but from what I heard, it's likely he'll be fired." And Jamal slowly nodded, feeling a jumble of emotions, relief that there might be consequences, but also a deep sadness that such a situation had occurred at all. "Thank you for letting me know," he said softly, setting aside a stack of essays. Word spread quickly. And that afternoon, as Jamal locked up his classroom, a group of students approached him in the hallway. Darius, Amelia, and Luis among them. Mr. Harris, we heard about the cop, Darius said, concern in his eyes. He got what he deserved, Luis added, clenching a fist. He can't treat you like that. And Jamal, touched by their support, nodded. Thank you, guys, he said. But let's not celebrate too early. It's just a step in the right direction. Amelia tilted her head. Are you going to sue? She asked hesitantly. My mom said you should, and Jamal pursed his lips. I'm exploring my options, he answered truthfully, because Charisse had indeed urged him to file a civil suit against both Crawford and the department for damages and to send a strong message. The question lingered in his mind for several more days, until he finally met Charisse in her office to discuss the possibility. We have a solid case, she said, tapping a folder of evidence. We have video, witness statements, and an established pattern of behavior from Crawford. After much soul-searching, Jamal agreed to move forward, deciding that if his speaking out could prevent another innocent person from being terrorized, it was worth it. That choice set in motion a legal process that was by turns stressful and emotionally taxing, filling out legal documents, giving depositions, encountering online trolls who hurled racist comments under news articles about his case, but the unwavering support from friends, neighbors, and even students' parents kept Jamal going. Meanwhile, the departmental proceedings against Crawford were ongoing, with rumors swirling that he was scrambling to find a lawyer, trying to salvage his job and reputation. It was during that tense period that a surprising twist of fate occurred. Karma, some would later call it. One early morning, as dawn broke, a fire broke out in an old apartment complex on the edge of town. Smoke billowed into the sky, and residents scrambled to evacuate. Among them was Officer Crawford's elderly grandmother, who lived alone on the second floor. Unknown to most that she was related to him, because he rarely spoke of his personal life. As the flames spread rapidly through the rickety structure, neighbors pounded on doors, trying to ensure everyone got out. Jamal, who was driving by on his way to a volunteer reading program, saw the smoke and commotion and immediately pulled over, jumping out of his car to see how he could help. Is everyone out? He asked a frantic woman outside, who coughed into her sleeve. I think Miss S. Crawford's still inside, she gasped. She couldn't get down the stairs, and without hesitation, Jamal dashed toward the building, ignoring the shouts of others telling him to wait for the fire department. Heat and thick smoke assaulted him as he climbed the old wooden steps, calling out, Mrs. Crawford! Where are you? He found her trapped in the hallway, huddled near the floor, coughing violently. Help, she rasped, voice barely audible. I can't breathe. And Jamal carefully hoisted her up, ignoring the way the smoke burned his lungs. Come on, he said urgently, guiding her back the way he came. Hold on to me, and step by terrifying step, they descended the staircase, flames licking at the walls. Just as they reached the bottom, the building groaned and part of the ceiling collapsed behind them with a deafening crash, sending embers flying. Outside, the crowd cheered as Jamal emerged with Miss S. Crawford in his arms, both of them soaked in sweat and coughing from inhalation. Paramedics rushed over, whisking Mrs. Crawford onto a stretcher, administering oxygen. Jamal's eyes watered uncontrollably from the smoke, but he was alive, and so was she. He didn't even realize who she was related to until the next day, when local news carried the story of a hero teacher rescuing an elderly woman from a fire. That elderly woman turned out to be none other than Officer Crawford's grandmother. As the story spread, it reached Crawford's ears. He was livid and humiliated, in equal measure livid, that his personal family matters were being aired publicly, and humiliated that the man he'd tried to arrest, the man he'd brutalized, was the same man who saved his grandmother's life. The irony was so glaring that it became the talk of the town, and even those who had been vaguely on Crawford's side before couldn't ignore the poetic justice of it all. A few days later, Jamal was at home, arms wrapped in bandages from minor burns and scrapes, when there was a knock on his door. Opening it cautiously, he was shocked to see Sergeant Ellis and a pale-looking Officer Crawford standing on the porch. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harris," Ellis said politely. "May we come in?" Jamal hesitated, heart pounding, then he nodded, stepping aside. "Sure," he said quietly. The two officers entered, standing awkwardly in Jamal's modest living room. Crawford avoided direct eye contact, shifting his weight as though he was deeply uncomfortable. Ellis cleared his throat. "Crawford here wanted to say something," he began, glancing pointedly at the officer. Crawford swallowed hard, removing his cap and wringing it in his hands like a reprimanded child. He started, voice raspy. "I want to say thank you for saving my grandmother," and Jamal blinked, fighting the urge to let out a sarcastic laugh. Because the last time he saw Crawford, the man was cuffing him against a squad car. But he swallowed that bitterness, simply nodding. "She needed help," Jamal said. "I'm glad I could help." Crawford nodded too, eyes downcast. "I also wanted to apologize," he mumbled, each word clearly dragging out of him with painful reluctance, "for what I did. I had no right to treat you that way. He trailed off, struggling for words, and Ellis put a hand on his shoulder. "Go on," he said sternly. Crawford took a breath. "I was wrong," he managed. "It was my bias, my anger. I'm sorry." And silence filled the room for a moment, thick and heavy. Jamal studied Crawford's face, recalling every detail of that day, the cruelty in his eyes, the sneer on his lips. He could see, maybe for the first time, genuine remorse flickering there, or at least something close to it. "Thank you for apologizing," Jamal said finally, voice measured. "But you know this doesn't erase what you did. Not just to me, but who knows how many others." Crawford nodded, pressing his lips tightly together. "I know," he said in a hollow tone. "I've been recommended for termination, and I'll probably lose my badge," he added. "But I still wanted to thank you for saving my grandmother. She's everything to me." Sergeant Ellis spoke then. "Mr. Harris, I want you to know that we're making changes in the department," he said. "Training, oversight, accountability. I know it doesn't fix what happened, but we don't want this to repeat." And Jamal nodded. "I appreciate hearing that," he replied, though only time would tell if it was genuine change or just talk. After a few more moments of tense conversation, Ellis and Crawford left. Jamal closed the door, leaning against it and letting out a long, shaky breath, feeling both drained and strangely lighter, as though some cosmic circle had been completed. The lawsuit proceeded nonetheless. Charisse insisted that it was not just about Jamal, but about forcing institutional reforms. In the end, there was a settlement with the city, with part of the funds allocated to Jamal for his ordeal and legal fees, and a significant portion earmarked for community programs aimed at policing reform and youth education about civil rights and law enforcement interactions. Jamal also pressed for the creation of a citizen review board that could independently investigate allegations of police misconduct, a move that the city council debated fiercely but ultimately approved, thanks to the public pressure and the notoriety of Jamal's case. In the aftermath, the grocery store on Elm Street became something of a local landmark. People would point and say, "That's where it happened," referencing either the day Jamal was wrongfully arrested or the moment the community stood up and refused to let it slide. And for Jamal, life took on a new normal. He continued teaching, pouring his energy into his students, especially encouraging them to engage in civic matters, to speak up for themselves and others. If you see injustice, he'd tell them, don't just walk by. Use your voice. Change might start with just one person, one phone camera, one voice calling out, "This is wrong." Some weeks later, Jamal visited Miss S. Crawford in the hospital. She was still recovering from the effects of smoke inhalation, and though he hadn't expected to, he felt compelled to check on her. She blinked in surprise when he walked into her room. "Oh, you're that young man," she rasped, fiddling with her the fourth tubes. "You saved me." and Jamal smiled gently. I did what anyone would do, he said. Pulling a chair closer to her bed, how are you feeling? She shrugged. Breathing still a little rough, but I'm alive, she said, voice soft. I heard about what happened between you and my grandson, and Jamal waited, unsure of how she felt. I'm sorry he did that to you, she murmured. I didn't raise him that way. And Jamal bit his lip, unsure how to respond. He's dealing with the consequences, he said carefully, and she nodded, a sad expression crossing her face. Yes, he is, she agreed. After a pause, she reached out a wrinkled hand, and Jamal accepted it gently. I'm so grateful to you, she said, tears brimming in her eyes. No matter what he did, you saved me. And Jamal felt a tightness in his chest. I couldn't just leave you there, he said, voice wavering slightly. No one should have to die in that fire. The hospital beeped softly with the rhythms of medical equipment, and for a long moment, there was silence. Finally, Jamal stood. I wish you a speedy recovery, he said, and she mustered a smile. Thank you. God bless you, she whispered. And as Jamal left, he couldn't help but feel that life had a strange way of weaving threads of hatred and compassion together. Months later, the official departmental hearing concluded Crawford was dismissed from the police force, and the city issued a public statement acknowledging the role systemic bias played in the incident. It was a small victory in a larger struggle, but a victory nonetheless. Jamal's lawsuit settlement, combined with funds from supportive donors, launched a new program at the school, a community bridge initiative, which provided workshops on civil rights, community policing forums, and resources to teach students about the history and implications of racial profiling. Seeing the smiles of young learners engaging with officers who genuinely wanted to build trust, hearing their bright voices ask questions about fairness, justice, and empathy, those moments gave Jamal hope. One afternoon, Charisse visited the school to see how the program was going, and she found Jamal in a classroom, discussing the Bill of Rights with a group of 10th graders. Hey, Teacher of the Year, she teased gently when the students were dismissed. Heard any more from the city after that apology letter? Indeed, the story spread far beyond their small city. Media outlets sometimes reached out, wanting interviews, but Jamal turned most of them down, preferring to keep the focus on teaching and the local reforms. Occasionally, a student would bring up the incident in class. Mr. Harris, can you tell us about the day you got arrested? Meanwhile, Beverly's footage remained a testament to the power of bystander intervention, and she and Jamal became unexpected friends. They'd meet for coffee sometimes and talk about how that day changed everything. I was so scared, she admitted once. I was thinking, what if the officer took my phone, or worse, shot me for recording? And Jamal nodded. You were brave, Beverly, he said. If not for that footage, who knows what story they would have spun? And she smiled sadly. We did the right thing, she said, and Jamal agreed wholeheartedly. One day, Jamal decided to revisit the grocery store, partly to thank Mr. Huang and Wesley again for speaking up, partly to see if things felt normal. When he walked in, Mr. Huang gave him a warm smile. Mr. Jamal, welcome, he said, beckoning him over to the counter. How have you been? And Jamal exhaled. Getting better every day, he admitted. Thank you again for what you did. And Mr. Huang shook his head. It was the least I could do, he said. We stick up for our own here. And Wesley, stacking some produce, chimed in. We're just glad you're okay. And Jamal nodded. I am, he said, feeling the tension in his chest ease a little. I am okay. As he left, bag of groceries in hand, Jamal paused outside, reflecting on the events of the past few months, how close he'd come to being locked away on false charges, how quickly people had rallied around him, how ironically he'd ended up saving the life of the officer's grandmother. In a world that often felt unjust, there was some measure of cosmic justice in that twist of fate. Maybe that was what people meant by karma stepping in, the idea that cruelty couldn't remain unchallenged forever, that eventually, life had a way of demanding accountability. For Jamal, the experience was transformative. He no longer walked through life with naive trust in the system, but neither did he carry bitterness in his heart. Instead, he carried a balanced perspective, a recognition that while darkness existed, there was also an unyielding light in the hearts of those who refused to stay silent, who intervened, who stood together. He would forever remember the look on Crawford's face, the anger, the fear, and eventually the shame, and how that same man had to swallow his pride and give thanks to someone he once saw as a threat. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. And so Jamal continued teaching, living, loving his community, knowing that each day was an opportunity to shape minds, to spark conversations that could prevent another unjust arrest, another act of violence or discrimination. He never saw Officer Crawford again, but sometimes he'd hear whispers that the man was trying to rebuild his life somewhere else. If Jamal ever thought about him, it was with a distant sense of pity rather than hatred, hoping maybe Crawford had truly learned something from what had happened. Because in the end, that was the greatest victory Jamal could hope for, a world in which hearts and minds were changed, piece by piece, day by day. And maybe that, he thought, as he walked back to his car, was exactly how karma worked, by turning the tables in ways no one could predict, shining a light on wrongdoing, and giving people a chance to choose a better path, even if that choice arrived in the wake of fiery destruction or public shame. He started the engine, glancing once more at the grocery store that had been the site of his trauma and the catalyst for so much change, then pulled away, feeling the slightest smile tug at the corners of his mouth, a quiet determination glowing in his eyes. Life would go on, lessons would be learned, and as long as there were people willing to stand up against injustice, there would always be hope for something better.